and Privilege, published by the Chicago University Press in 2023. Welcome, Melissa.
Thank you so much, and thanks for bearing with me and waiting for me to start late. So I will dive right in. So what this book does is really draws on research I've been doing and reading and consuming for over 20 years now, looking at income inequality and social mobility in the economic families in the US. And I want to situate the topic in the context of our broader public conversation about inequality and social mobility in America. And in my experience as a poverty researcher, there's lots of evidence in all of the academic journals about the link between single motherhood and disadvantaged positions of kids. But whenever I've been in policy conversations, including with other academics and economists focused on inequality and social mobility in America, in my experience, that conversation almost always over the course of multiple days really focuses on government programs and the need to, shore up the safety net, have improved schools, affordable housing, more progressive tax code, all things that I'm on board with and have often pushed for. But I feel like there's this elephant in the room, which is the need for stronger families. And so I decided to marshal all the evidence and make this case. I had been hoping, the first thing I said to my publisher was, I don't want to write a hot take book. So my actual goal was to take this issue that I think we've struggled to talk about for a long time and be honest about, take it out of the culture wars and make it something that we were sort of more free to talk about based on the data and evidence. So that's what I'm doing in this book. And I start with this basic fact that over the past 40 years, there's been this really tremendous change in the way kids in the US are being raised. In particular, there's been a massive decline over the past 40 years in the share of US kids growing up in a married parent home. So that's fallen from 77% in 1980 to 63% in 2020. And really importantly, it's not that 37% of kids in the US are then just living with unmarried parents who essentially co-parent as if they were married, but in all but name. And that's not what's happening. So only 8% of US kids live with cohabiting parents, but that overstates the case because in about 25 to 40% of those instances, the second partner in the home is not the child's second biological parent. In fact, it's often like a boyfriend of the mom. Okay, so that's very different. And it's also the case, too, that even if a child is with unmarried parents at any given point in time, there's a lot of instability in that relationship. I mean, in practice, this is how that institution works in the US. And so that child is much more likely to be with only their mom over some point. Okay, so more than 1 in 5 kids in the US lives with only their mother. And just to, put this in full context, another roughly like 4.9% live with only their father and 4.5% live with neither parent, like with a grandparent or something. All right. So this is US kids are more likely than any other kids in the world to live with one parent. And this is something I'm taking from the Pew Research Center, did this amazing survey of 130 countries and found this fact. So the way they documented is that 23% of US kids are in single parent homes. The average in the European Union is 13%. The worldwide average is 7%. So this is a uniquely American distinction, one that, is not something I think we should be proud of or celebrate. Okay. The really, really important point and a key theme in my book is that there's now a college gap in the way kids are growing up. And so crucially, in response to the idea that maybe this is US exceptionalism because US mothers are more able to afford this, it is not the most economically successful women in US society who are in large numbers raising their kids on their own or in their own home. So the decline in married parent families among children whose moms have a 4-year college degree, that has fallen from 90% to 84%. And this small reduction is even more remarkable when we realize how much bigger and heterogeneous this group has gotten. So this group is not nearly as elite or select or small as it was at the beginning of the period. Now, like 30% of moms have a 4-year college degree as compared to 11%. And yet still, married parent homes for kids is holding quite steady in that group. The big story, which I think is completely unappreciated, is that there's been a massive decline in married parent families in the middle of the education distribution. Moms with a high school degree or some college are now just as likely to be raising their kids in married parent homes, essentially as the most disadvantaged moms in society, those with less than a high school degree. Okay, so it's down. That's a huge decrease from 83% to 60% among that middle group. And so, of course, because of the composition, this is the majority of moms. This is what's driven the large decrease in kids living in married parent homes is being driven by what's happening outside the college educated class. Cohabitation doesn't close these gaps. Kids whose moms don't have a college degree, 29-30% of them live with a mom and no romantic partner in the house, whether married or not, as compared to 12% among the kids of four-year college educated parents. There is a longstanding difference in the levels of married parent homes between white and Black children in the US. This divide happened in the 60s and 70s. And so in the, people in the 60s and 70s and early 80s, scholars recognized this divide such that Black children were more likely to be living outside a married parent home. I mean, at rates far lower than they are now, but there was an emergence of this Black-white gap. A lot of scholars wrote about it in the 80s. A lot of that conversation took on very unfortunate tones, which is a large part of the reason why this has become a bit of a hard topic to sort of engage with. But what has emerged in the 40 years that I'm focused on and studying in my book is the emergence of this college gap among whites, among Hispanics, and among Blacks. And interestingly, and something I didn't know until I did the data work for this book, we do not see that college gap among Asians. So you could see here white children whose mom have a four-year degree, 88% of them live in married parent homes as compared to 60 and 69% among less educated. The children of Black mothers who have a four-year college degree are twice as likely as the children of Black mothers who don't have a college degree to live in a married parent home. And again, quite strikingly, the shares of two-parent homes among Asian children in this country is uniformly high, regardless of education. We did not see this college gap in 1980. So here in 1980, you can see the level differences across whites and Blacks, but you don't see this college gap. That's the sort of new story that's happened in the past 40 years that is really the key theme in my book. Yvonne, I can't see if people want to interrupt. Will you tell me if someone wants to jump in?
Don't worry. I'll be moderating, so don't worry. You don't need to track that.
Okay.
Whenever someone asks a question, I'll let you know.
Okay.
Actually, can I ask a clarification, Melissa?
Yeah.
Do you want us to stick to clarification questions or substantive as you go?
However you want to do it. If you raise a substantive question that I will get to later, I'll just defer it. So whatever you prefer.
Thank you.
Okay. So one of the things I want also, like with this theme of the college,
there is a question actually by Johan.
Okay.
Yeah, hi. How are we classifying Asians? Are we classifying Asians as native born and foreign born?
Yes, that's a good question. Hispanics and Asians in this table are both native and native and foreign born. If I've done it both ways, I'm pretty sure this is the one that shows it both ways. The education gradient is a bit larger among Hispanics if I restrict it to native born. But yeah, good question. Okay. All right. So a key point I want to make, and like you'll see this throughout the talk and in the book, the divergence in family structure is both an effect of the forces that have driven inequality and also a cause of additional inequality. And the sort of real point I'm trying to emphasize is if we don't break it, it will be a key mechanism perpetuating advantage and disadvantage across generations. But just in the static sense, that mechanically this family structure divergence has amplified household inequality in the US. And that's what I'm showing you in these numbers. Everything is from the census, by the way, in the ACS. So in the top panel here, what I'm showing you is household earnings For the households with kids who have two parents. So this is something, that labor economists would do. Let's condition on having two parents in the household, and let's look at what happened to earnings. Among households with two parents headed by, or that has a mom with a 4-year college degree, earnings went up by 59%. In the middle group, they went up by 8%. In the bottom group, they went down by 14%. This is the familiar story of rising earnings inequality. The top did very well. The middle, maybe did a little bit better, mostly stagnant. The bottom, not so well. If we just look at homes with unpartnered mothers, then earnings went up among the college-educated unpartnered mothers because college men and women both did quite well over this period. Earnings also went up among the high school, some college, and less than high school mothers. This won't be surprising to anyone who studies this population. Welfare reform, the earned income tax credit, all of those things contributed to higher employment rates among single moms over this 40-year period. And also single moms are becoming less negatively selected on observables, right? It's becoming much more common. So this isn't surprising. What I think is quite striking and underappreciated is that once we look at household earnings and we don't condition on the number of parents and we just allow that to change as it did, now we see the economic security of the middle group has eroded. So instead of an 8% or 19% increase in earnings, it's gone down by 4%. Why? Because households with a mom with a high school degree are now 20 percentage points more likely to only have one adult in the house than two. So this is a mechanical result coming from the fact that when there are two adults in the house, you almost always have higher earnings, okay? And so that increased likelihood of setting up a home by yourself as a mom with a high school degree has eroded economic security for that middle group. And
Quick
even
question.
more so for the less than high school group.
Quick question. When you look at household earnings, are you deflating by the CPI or the PCE?
PCE.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. Final point on what's happening and why we should care about this. The children's upward mobility is undermined by this, both at an individual level and what we learned from the work by Chetty, Hendren, Klein, and Sayas, potentially at a neighborhood level. So in their 2014 QJE paper, one of the first papers that looked at the geographic differences across the country in rates of upward mobility across neighborhoods, literally figure 4 in that paper took my breath away, because all of the things we spend so much of our energy focused on in talking about access, to affordable college, state EITC exposure, those things had very weak correlation with kids' rates of upward mobility. The fraction of households in a neighborhood that were married, the fraction of households in a neighborhood with single moms, these were two of the most highly correlated factors with rates of upward mobility. And I have to say, I really took that finding, and it came out at the same time as Hillbilly Elegy, J.D. Vance's book. I took it to heart because I was like, we don't really, as economists, talk nearly enough about these things that look like culture because we don't really know what to do about them. But I think this is quite striking because we don't just see it at a household level, we see it as a neighborhood level. All right. So what is driving these trends? There's a whole bunch of things that people sometimes speculate is going on that's not. So I'll do this quickly, but in the book, I spend a good amount of time just saying, here's what's actually going on, what's driving this at a sort of, again, descriptive level. This is not a story of more divorce. Divorce in the US conditional on marriage is down. This is a story of more parents never being married in the first place. So if we just look at the status of unpartnered mothers, in 1980, 64% of them had been married to their child's father at some point and were divorced. Now that's 39%. So what's quite striking about this, I think, is that now a small majority of unpartnered mothers were never married in the first place. Okay, so a lot of the pushback I've been getting in the first, 9 days my book is out is like, are you telling women to stay in bad marriages? No, of course I'm not telling women to stay in bad marriage, but more to the point, that's not what's driving this, right? Now it's what we're really talking about is more and more couples who have a child together never get married in the first place. And we see, there's two things. We see this across education groups, but even here, there's a college divide. So in 2019, unpartnered mothers with a 4-year college degree, 57% of them are divorced as compared to 32% having never been married. For the lower two education groups, that's reversed. And even this matters because my lens on this issue is really about resources. And I'll talk and define exactly what I mean about that. But I'm really talking about what I'm really concerned about is that single parent households have many fewer resources than 2-parent households. And that's what's putting the kids at a disadvantage. Divorced parents, those kids have access to higher resources. Why? Because they were more likely to have had their second parent, almost always a dad, in the house at some point. So for some part of their childhood, they had 2 parents in the home. They're twice as likely, even conditional on education group, kids of parents are divorced are twice as likely to receive child support as those whose parents have never been married. And they're also more likely to have engagement with their parent. So even this divide, this college divide in the status of unpartnered mothers contributes to these class gaps in kids' childhood experiences and outcomes. We similarly see differences across racial ethnic groups in unpartnered mothers' status. So 70% of children who live with an unpartnered Black mother, their mother was never married, as compared to 32% among Asians, 54% among Hispanics, and 38% among whites. And again, this matters for childhood resources and having the engagement with a second parent. Okay, this is driven, this increase in kids, mothers having never been married corresponds to a reduction in marriage overall that we see this college divide. So what I'm showing you here is I go back to the 1960s and these two figures, even though almost everything else I'm just showing you from 1980 to 2020, because what's interesting here, and I think important to keep in mind for the historical context, is in the 1960s and 70s, when there were massive social and cultural changes that changed gender norms, weakened the social imperative of being married, we see a reduction in marriage among men and women in fairly equal proportion across the education distribution. But notice in 1980 and 90s, things really changed in that the decline in marriage stalled out among college-educated adults, but it continued to fall throughout the period, especially for this middle group. And so this is why now college-educated adults, I already showed you moms, but it's true that college-educated adults are much more likely to be married than others.
And I want to go back to the resources point you raised.
Yeah.
Clearly on the private sector side, but we have a lot of social programs that essentially exclude married families, because they're based on household variables and not individual. So is it really the resources, or is it some kind of incentives that are different depending on where the resources are coming from?
So when I'm talking about, okay, so one thing, there's a lot of different answers I can give you depending on what you're getting at precisely, but just in terms of the household income that I just showed you, I'm pretty sure the one I put in the talk is earnings, but if I do it by income, you still see a difference. So that just speaks to the fact that single parent families are getting some of the sort of missing earnings from a second parent replaced at a higher rate, by social programs, but the point about divergent income would hold. Yes, there are perverse incentives in our tax code and our transfer system that favor unmarried parents, which is, when I get to the policy conclusions, that's like low-hanging fruit. That's something we should change. When I say resources matter, and I'm going to talk about this, I mean, what is the mechanism by which married parent homes tend to deliver better outcomes for their kids? And my argument is it's because they have more resources, and I mean resources to be more broad than simply income. But I'll talk at length about that.
But I don't know exactly what data sets you're using, but something like CPS would not capture Medicaid as income and wouldn't capture participation in a lot of the programs as well.
Yeah. Okay. So 70% of single moms receive Medicaid. The point is, even if you're a single mom on Medicaid, on average, you're going to have less parenting resources than a household with 2 adults. Another way, well, I'm going to come back to this because this is like, the meat of it. Another way to say this is if the resource differences were completely closed, then we wouldn't see such large gaps. Okay. All right. Oh, this is just more on the decline in marriage. You can see it's driven primarily, again, outside the college educated class. And this, I just do it by education crossed with race, ethnicity. All right. So what are the explanations? Why has there been this decline in marriage? This is a bit of a detour, but while I'm explaining, what's been driving this, it's not divorce, it's an increase in non-marriage among mothers, which reflects, this large decrease in marriage. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about my read of the evidence of why is marriage down outside the college educated class. I think there's 4 primary explanations that scholars have put forward. One is the marriageable male hypothesis, and this dates back to William Julius Wilson's really important observations in the 1980s. The marriageable male idea that he put forward was that if male partners don't offer economic stability or stable earnings, then women might postpone or avoid marriage. And at the time when he was writing, he was trying to explain, he was using this to explain why there were large differences emerging between Black and white families. And he was talking about, he created this marriageable men pool index and said, look, Black men are more likely to be out of work. They're more likely to be incarcerated. That reflects a whole bunch of things, including discrimination in the labor market, harsh criminal justice systems that have disproportionate impact, all of those factors that contribute to fewer, as a share, Black men being considered marriageable. He proposed that was driving this gap in family structure. Looking at it now, I'm focused less on the racial differences, but this emergence of this education class divide. It certainly fits with recent trends in earnings in marriage, and there's causal evidence from some recent contexts that would support this idea that a decline in the marriageable male has contributed to this decline in marriage outside the college educated class. And I'll show you some of this. I just want to put all the explanations on the table. There's also, it's really tough to distinguish 1 and 2 in the data. Women's relative economic position has improved. So even if men were, let's say, as stably employed or bringing in earnings the same way they used to, now women are less likely to need to rely on a man for her financial security. And so the question is, as women have become more financially, as they've gained economically, both in absolute terms and relative to men, are more of them deciding that marriage, isn't worth it or necessary. Okay.
Can I ask you something, Melissa?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you're familiar with a book that Nicholas Everstadt just published on a different phenomenon. I think the title of the book is Men Without Work, and he basically documents that over 6 million prime-age men are neither working nor looking for work. Maybe this is a completely unrelated phenomenon.
No, it's totally related. I have his book right behind me somewhere. It's completely related. And also his work shows that, also one of the things I get when I say, like, there's 15% of prime age men now are not in the workforce. And then people are like, well, maybe they're home taking care of their kids. No, they're not. And he shows that in his work too. Yeah, no, his work on this, Men Without a Work, is very much related to this observation or this stipulation that there's been a decrease in the marriageable man outside the college educated class. Okay,
Can
Charles.
I ask another one?
Yeah.
About number 2. So women's relative economic positions has improved. Lots of good data on that. But presumably it hasn't improved that much overall, or we wouldn't be worrying as much, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Okay.
So
Okay.
yes.
Okay, thanks.
And again, women with college degrees, they bring in high income, but they're also still doing this with a partner, a married partner. And so again, this is why I titled it The Two-Parent Privilege, because the groups with advantages, they're the ones with this double advantage of now having like 2 highly educated high earners in the household. And that's passing on a lot of advantages and privileges to their kids. And so marriage has become, in some sense, a luxury good. And I think that should concern us. Okay, people also have put forth, and I think Nick Eberstadt leans a little bit more heavily into this than I might, about cultural shifts, or Charles Murray will push on this, that it's more an erosion of sort of the cultural importance of men working, and a move away from productive values. And then the fourth is the idea that welfare makes single motherhood more feasible or attractive. And it's, I think this is what Kesey was getting at, it's the welfare state that's driving people away from marriage. So let me just show you descriptively, this idea, men, when I'm just doing these crude groups, right? Again, this is just to make the descriptive point that the trends line up. If I'm just looking at my 3 education groups times 4 major race ethnic groups, it is the case that men for whom earnings have gone up the most have experienced the smallest decreases in marriage, and vice versa. Okay, so the trends line up. Also, the trend goes in the predicted direction. The groups for whom women's relative earnings have gone up the most, that's where you've seen the largest decreases in marriage rates. So even though college-educated women are doing well, they have made the fewest gains relative to men in their education group. And that's where you see, marriage declining, essentially not at all, right? So the trends line up with both 1 and 2. And then there's causal evidence of an economic link. So the papers that look at trade pressures from China find that in communities that were impacted by increased import competition, when a loss of manufacturing jobs, which was a really nice source of sort of middle-class wages for non-college educated men, when those go away, or when those are reduced, you see an increase in the share of kids living in single mother homes. There's another nice paper that shows in a very similar way, communities that lost sort of these middle class jobs for non-college educated men to the adoption of industrial robots, you see an increase in the share of kids living in single parent homes. And Namashinov has a very nice paper looking at using a shift share instrument based on the occupational composition of an area in places where women exogenously experienced larger relative increases in their earnings compared to men. You see a sizable decrease in marriage. All right, so I think this holds some water. I used to say, like 10 years ago, if you asked me, what would it take to reverse things? And I don't want to get ahead of myself, and I tried to figure out where to put this discussion, but I think I put it here because I'm going to also give some credence to this idea that changing social norms matter. And one of my own studies is like what changed my priors on this, that economics isn't going to be enough. Even if it's true that, let's say you had 60s and 70s, you had these changes in social norms. We come into the 80s with this relaxed social norm about marriage. Non-college educated men get hit with these economic shocks that, disadvantage them both in a level and relative sense. And then we see marriage start to break down outside the college educated class, even among couples who have a child together. What happens when a good thing comes in and helps the economic position of non-college educated men? And so the one context we have that did that was the fracking boom in the early 2000s. So in a study with my former PhD student, Riley Wilson, we looked at the family formation response to that. And we look outside of North Dakota and South Dakota, since that was a lot of migrant workers. In the other fracking communities across the country, when there was a fracking boom, you see that earnings went up, both absolute and relative, for non-college educated men. And you see that births went up. So kids are normal goods. People have shown that before. But they went up in equal proportion for married and unmarried folks. And there was no reduction in the non-marital birth share. So this is not what I expected to find, because I was sort of looking to see if there was a reverse marriageable men story, which is what I expected, but the data clearly reject that. So we looked, at variation across places, and the increase in births among non-married couples was larger in counties where there was already a higher baseline share of kids being born outside of marriage, suggesting a role for sort of social context. And then we revisited the coal boom and bust of the 70s and 80s, very similar economic shock. Coal prices went up. The earnings of non-college educated men in these sort of rural communities went up. Coal producing communities went up. You saw an increase in married births, but you saw an increase in marriage, and you saw a decrease in the non-marital birth share. And this, to me, is suggestive that the family formation response to a very similar economic shock depends on the social context you're living in. So in the 70s and 80s, when there was a tighter norm and convention of having kids within marriage, additional income only increased births among married couples. And in 2000s, even if couples were inclined to take advantage of the extra income by starting a family, they didn't feel like they needed to be married to do that. And so here's why I think it's both, in terms of both explanation and just a preview, where what I think would have to happen to change things going forward, both economics and social norms are playing an important part.
But I'm not sure, you know, if my neighbor gets welfare and that makes her change her behavior, and my behavior depends on her behavior, that's the social norms. Really, you go down to it, the causal thing was the welfare. The social norms was just a mechanism by which the welfare program affects me. It's not just my personal welfare payments. And the other point you made about the fracking, you know, raising children is a fairly long-term enterprise. And, you know, the guy may be doing great driving the trucks in rural Colorado, but that might be a 2-year gig. And then, you know, he's found his income cut by a factor of 3. And, you know, what kind of father will he be then?
Yeah, but you still had a kid with him. So that's the point. Okay, great. This guy has earnings now. I don't want to marry him because he might not have them in 5 years, but I'm still going to have a kid with him.
Right, but a permanent increase in the male's earning might have a very different effect in marriage. That was my point.
No, but it doesn't change the point that sort of the threshold response is different for having a kid and getting married. Right? The other thing, though, on a practical note about that point about these being temporary and transitory, a lot of the increase in earnings are not in oil and gas extraction. So these really were localized economic shocks. Like there's also retail and other things went up. But I still think the point remains as like, well, maybe this is just maybe I'm really forward looking and I know the boom is going to go away in 5 years, but then it's still quite noteworthy then that I think it's okay to have a child with this person, just not commit to being married to them. Okay, here's where you're really going to disagree with me, though, because here's where I'm going to say that.
No, just Melissa, on that point, it should go the other way, right? Because marriage is a risk, you're sharing risk. So if you really think it's a temporary thing, you should want to share that risk. And so it should go the other way. You shouldn't have a kid and you should get married.
Yeah, no, that would make more sense if we think of marriage as the contract to pool resources and to share risk. If we wrote down a standard economic model of when you should make these decisions, that might be what we wrote down, but that's not what happened in practice, right? Okay, so here's why I don't think the reason why we have such a high share of, you know, why 30% of kids in this country are living outside a 2-parent household is because of overly generous welfare benefits. And the big thing is that over this time period, welfare has become less generous. And yet the share of kids outside a 2-parent home continued to grow and is now far beyond the group of people who typically relied on welfare. So we are not just talking about teen moms anymore. Right? This is now, you look at a lot of these moms, as I showed you, they have a high school degree, they have some college, they are well beyond the eligibility for welfare. So this just isn't a concentrated story of really disadvantaged people relying on welfare. Okay, so in fact, 88 for the median or the modal, for the typical mom who's unpartnered, 88% of her household income comes from her own earnings. Only 40% of these moms receive any sort of cash welfare. Now, 70% of them do receive Medicaid, but I do not think that Medicaid is what's driving this. Now, would we have fewer single moms if we withheld all support from them? My read of the evidence is, on the margin, this makes a difference in the direction you would predict. So more generous welfare leads to higher, but that increment is very small. And if I look at what's happened since 1990, even if you take that small positive effect, we would have expected a reduction in the share of kids growing up in single parent homes because it's become less generous. Now, what I will readily concede is that the counterfactual share of single mothers might have been higher in the post-96 world if we didn't have welfare reform. But welfare reform came in, made it harder to qualify for benefits, really reduced the availability of cash welfare. And yet, we still see this rise. And if we look across countries that have much more supportive safety nets, we still see a much lower share of kids living in one-parent homes. So I'm not denying that there's this positive link between a more generous welfare system leads to a small increment, positive increment in share of single-parent households. But the reason we have 30% of kids living outside married parent homes is not because our welfare system is too generous. Yeah, someone has their hand up.
Yeah, I have a question about so what you're talking about right now. So, I mean, couldn't one argue that the damage had been done and it created a culture due to the generous sort of giving of welfare? It's like, if welfare is incredibly generous in the 70s, 80s, early 90s, the damage has been done and it creates a culture where people are adverse to having children because it's not as socially acceptable as it once was. It is now.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a bit more elusive, and I don't know how you.
No. But I agree. I agree with your point. So if I were writing like what happened to family structure between the 60s and 80s, then I would be inclined to put more blame on welfare. And so, but you're totally right to say, well, maybe we went into the 80s with this norm already being broken, and this is what Murray would have said, in part because of like welfare in the 60s and 70s. But what's happened over the next 40 years? I think it's an interesting question of like, this norm has become much more widespread. So I think to say, well, welfare caused this change in social norm, which is what we're seeing now, it's harder. It's not impossible, but it's harder for me to wrap my head around. It's just sort of this idea of this break between having a kid and being married. Right. That's like really broken now outside the college educated class. Like, so that's really my point. It's not that the most disadvantaged groups that have high rates of welfare participation are doing something that looks different from everybody else. It's sort of spread. To a much wider swath of the population. It's not impossible that like that was the seed that got things going. But in terms of what's happened the past 40 years, my point is it's not that our welfare system has become far too generous.
But don't you need to measure, like Otter and Duggan did, don't you need to measure the change over time in welfare generosity relative to the earnings of the men who, should have been at home?
Yeah, it's decreased.
Is that how you measured? You measured with PCE?
Oh, no. I'm not putting that in here. I'm not putting that in here. I'm not looking at that. So
Otter and Duggan piece was about how disability had gotten much more generous relative to the men's wages in that category.
Yeah.
Which is different than saying it. They both could go down, right? The question is which goes down more.
Yeah. This is not a novel contribution of my paper. There's like a gajillion studies looking at the link between what's happened to welfare generosity in single parent homes. My read of that, some of it I've contributed to, but lots of other people, is the coefficient is very small. And in the last 2 decades, you would have predicted things going in the opposite direction. Okay, I'm going to go on to births. This is not being driven by young women, groups that have typically had high rates of single motherhood. This is not being driven by births increasing among those groups. Births are way down in the US. They're down over 70% among teenagers. Okay, basically the only women who are having more births than they used to are women above the age of 30. So what's really amazing is despite this huge increase in teen births to women in their young 20s, we've still had this large increase in single parenthood. This isn't unrelated to what we were just talking about, because my whole point is we've now moved well beyond, one parent households have moved well beyond these highly disadvantaged groups. If you told me in the early 1990s that teen childbearing was going to decrease by over 70%, I think most scholars would have predicted that the share of single parent households also went down. And so the rise in single parent households in this country has happened despite changes in birth rates that would have pushed things in the opposite direction. Here's another way to say it. moms are older and more educated than they used to be by a lot. So in 2019, only 5% of births are to teen moms. 19% are to moms over the age of 35. 12% of births are to moms with less than high school. 33% are to moms with college degree. Based on what happened to the composition, the observable composition of moms, if people were getting married at the same rate as they were before, the rates of single parenthood would have plummeted. All right. But the share of non-marital births has increased. It's now 40% of births in the US are now outside marriage. 40%. This is a huge increase in 40 years. Why? This gets back to the story I was telling, because non-marital births have increased basically for everybody. All right. So the convention of having and raising a kid inside marriage is what's broken apart, largely outside the college-educated class. So even among college-educated moms, the non-marital birth share has more than doubled, but it's still only 11%. This middle group of moms with a high school degree or some college, the share of those births that are outside of marriage has more than doubled. Okay. And you see this, again, women in their 20s. So teen moms, yes, almost all of those births are outside marriage, but now they count for a very, very small share of births. It's women in their 20s now. A small majority of those births are outside of marriage. Hispanic women and white women. Again, Black women, the rates of non-marital births among Black women in this country is always very high. 66%, or back to 1990, 66% to 70%. But look at what happened among whites and Hispanics, right? So this middle group is really driving things. Okay, so just to wrap up, I think it's sort of clear where I was pushing on explanations. 60s and 70s, there was a change in social norms and attitudes. And then in the 80s, you've got these shocks, economic changes that really sort of hurt the relative economic and absolute position of non-college educated men. Those two things combined to lead to this decoupling of childbearing and marriage among affected populations and areas, such that now we're in a social paradigm where for large swaths of the population, the convention of having a kid with two parents in the house is broken down. And we're, obviously forward looking, like, what do I think has to happen to change things? I think we're going to need both economic and social changes to reverse things. All right. Let me get to the point about resources. So what does this all mean for kids? Why, all of this could have happened. And if single moms were being kept whole because they're super successful on their own and they don't need a man, or because the public transfers to single moms are so generous, they make up for having an additional person in the household. If all of that happened, we wouldn't see big differences in childhood environments, but all of that is not happening. And we see that married parent homes in a number of dimensions have more resources than single parent homes. Okay, why? So how do I think about marriage? It is a long-term contract to pool resources together and engage in the activity of having a household and raising children together. Okay. And it turns out in the US that contract, even though it's not always binding and people break it, it's much more productive of whether a child will actually spend their childhood with two parents in their home than any other arrangement or institution we've come up with. Right? So if cohabitation were such a strong institution that being married didn't matter, then we'd be having a different conversation. But that contract, for whatever reason, and people have different theories, but that is the most likely scenario that leads to kids having two parents in their home, combining the income of two people, combining the time of two people, and relying on the emotional energy of two people. So those are the three buckets of resources that I described at some length in the book: is income, spending, time, and emotional bandwidth. And critically, the whole point is this leads to differences in kids' outcomes. Okay. So again, a lot of the pushback I get is people want to talk about, oh, well, single moms rely on help from their relatives and their extended families, and you're ignoring all these other ways that moms make it work. First of all, 67% of kids living in single parent homes have no other adults in the household. Only 22% of them have a grandma in the household. So I don't want to discount the important role that extended family plays, but there's actually not strong evidence that kids in single parent homes are more likely to have repeated interactions with their grandparents, for instance. Okay, so extended families might be important, But if we saw that single moms were fully, or single parents, I should be careful. So let me just be clear. 25% of kids, 20% of kids live with an unpartnered mother, and another almost 5% live with an unpartnered father. But if single parents were fully making up for the gaps, we wouldn't see such large outcomes in kids. We wouldn't see such large gaps in kids' outcomes. What do we know? Over this time period, the amount of money that people in the parents in the top of the income distribution spend on their kids has gone bonkers. And by the way, this wildly understates it, because this doesn't even include college or housing. But the whole, college educated parents, high income parents are pulling away from everybody else. And I'm showing you spending on targeted kids investments here. How does this relate to family structure? Well, very few single parents get themselves into the top of the income distribution. So two parents are just more likely to have these high levels of combined income that they then use to shower these resource advantages on their kids, spending for all sorts of things, right? Education, tutoring, extracurricular activities, enriching vacations, all these things that you can imagine or you can expect affect kids' opportunities. If we look at time use data from the ATUS, we see that highly educated married parents spend more time with their kids. Some of this is driven by the fact that married mothers are less likely to work than unmarried mothers, but that's not all of it, okay? And this is just separate. So if you combine them, of course, kids in married parent homes get more parental time, right? And there is evidence that parental time is beneficial to kids' learning and educational performance, okay? So these kids don't just have more income or more money spent on them, they get more parental time.
But actually, if you look at the high school, some college versus four-year college, it's about the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the
Right.
other thing that, yeah, no, here we don't see as large of a college gap. We just see
Okay.
the
Okay.
gradient. And for all
There are two-
groups, we see the married, unmarried difference.
Okay.
There are a couple of questions, Ritin and then Jonathan.
Thank you. I had a very quick question, and this might seem trivial, but there's a stress on how, especially towards the remedies, that families with two parents are able to pool in more resources. If you just compare that with a family structure where there are two parents, but only one person is contributing economic resources, are there any studies on whether households where the income is coming from one individual are less likely to get divorced, period? Because it seems like, there's this general recommendation, and this might be the most politically incorrect recommendation, but if you make a recommendation that in most households only one person should have the income, that might actually make divorce less likely. And if that becomes the social norm, it might actually make getting married more likely as well, if that's something you ultimately care about, because then and this is perhaps the most politically incorrect.
That's okay. I won't ascribe it to you, but there are certainly people making this argument. That
I guess just to sum it up, isn't the best recommendation that we should somehow revert back to the gender norms? People rely on only one parent for the income, and therefore marriage is back. Like, that seems like the logical conclusion of what you're suggesting at the limit.
Yeah, no, this is a really important question, and I'm glad you raised it. So three things I think I want to say in response. So one, I was really committed to keeping this book to 200 pages, because I was like, I've got my Pickady's Capital here, but I feel like people don't really read more than 200 pages. So I didn't go down this path of describing there are studies about what's best for kids and who works and who doesn't. And because I take this sort of broad-based resource perspective, what I say is I'm agnostic about how any individual couple makes this work, right? So when I categorize married or two parents, some of them have two workers. Some of them optimize over the period of childhood, where one stays home the whole time, or one works part-time, or they both work part-time. The main point is that two-parent households, which are largely married parent households, they have more degrees of freedom. They can optimize in a whole bunch of different ways, and they could change it up. Married, unpartnered moms, single moms, they have no choice. They have to do it all by themselves, which is also why, they wind up having less time, and I will say emotional bandwidth, to spend with their kids, because they have no choice but to be the primary breadwinner. And so I am agnostic about how parents make that arrangement work. To your second point about what leads to if the relationship between income and divorce, there are studies showing, and I do mention this because I talk about the role of gender norms. There are studies showing that when a wife starts to bring in more than her husband, the hazard of divorce, the likelihood of divorce rises, right? So you could say that comes from the woman or from the man, but in equilibrium, that does lead to an increase in divorce. Third, what do I conclude from that? I very fervently, though other people disagree, I do not lament the economic progress or independence of women and say that, see, this was the whole darn problem. Once these women started going to work, they don't need the men anymore. And that's what increased rates of single parenthood. I think it's really interesting and important to reflect on the fact that college educated parents, those moms have the highest likelihood of working, and yet they're still married. So this is the kind of speculation that I don't do in the book, but I think this just what I'm showing descriptively raises these questions. Why is it that given a shrinking, I don't want to say equalization, but a closer equalization of rates of earnings or employment or expectations about childcare among the college educated class, those couples are still more likely to stay married and parent together? Is it because non-college educated men have a more patriarchal view of what marriage should look like and aren't willing, or non-college educated women have more of an expectation that the husband is a primary breadwinner? I don't know. I mean, I think there are clear differences though. And so, I think you have to come back to the idea that, well, college educated women are doing quite well, and they're still raising their kids almost entirely in married parent households.
Jonathan Berg.
Is there another question?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm just kidding. So, one thing I've learned about the society we live in today is the narrative really matters. And I think what we're working with over here is, the original unmarried child raised by an unmarried parent. It wasn't the parent's choice. It was some event that caused that to happen, maybe a death, or a really bad father walking out, or something like that. And so the narrative is we have to feel sorry for these people and we have to help them. Whereas today, what the evidence you seem to be suggesting is it's not. It's now a choice. And so then, isn't it onus on us to change that narrative in the sense that that's a bad choice, and we should not be feeling sorry for these people, and think if you make bad choices, there should be consequences.
Okay, so I actually hope that the whole tone in the book is actually one of empathy, because that is genuinely how I come at this. But let me defend my empathy in a moment. But let me say, your view that this is a choice now, not an event, that is exactly what drove us to the 1996 welfare reform. So when cash welfare in the US, which was limited to, it was called the AFDC program, it was limited to moms, single moms with kids. It was started in the 30s, basically for widowed women, or women who, during the Great Depression, when men left and they were essentially widowed, even if the dad just disappeared because he was out of work. Okay, so it was really for widowed women and their children. By the 1980s, the caseload on that cash welfare program, most of those women were never married. And so the tide did turn. Wait, these women, they're not widowed. They're choosing this. And this really is what led to welfare reform. And by the way, there were a whole lot of ugly stereotypes about the welfare queen, which is part of the reason why this conversation that I'm trying to restart became a conversation we weren't allowed to have, because there really were some awful racial stereotypes. And, your point being well taken, that wait, we've now created a system where women are incentivized not to have the guy in the house because they can't, then they lose their money. So welfare reform addressed a lot of that. Now, here's the way I think of this. So 40% of kids are being born outside of a marital union. And I think the right way to think about this is there is huge variation in that population. So there are some people in extreme cases for whom this isn't an actual choice or a choice that's a meaningful choice. If you're, the father of your child is abusive or violent, I mean, intimate partner violence, especially in a lot of these affected communities, is shockingly common, right? So some of these choices are not really choices. But then again, because this is now so common, it seems clear to me that the social convention is so broken that there are plenty of people who are making a choice. He's not my soulmate. We had a kid together, but I'm going to keep looking for a better husband, right? And it is interesting. I mean, this came up in our discussion about the fracking experiment. People seem more reluctant to marry somebody than to have a child with them. And so I just want to be very clear. I think we have to be very careful, because one of the things that I argue for is I think we need a return or a reinforcement and an acknowledgement that two-parent households are better for kids. And I think there are a lot of sort of incremental couples that maybe they wouldn't be gloriously happy together, but their child would benefit. But there are also a lot of couples for whom it's not a meaningful choice. The second parent really wouldn't be productive. And so grappling with that, I think, is really important. All right, let me run through what I have. I don't have that much more, I don't think. I can't see my numbers. Look, okay, I'll skip this. Additional considerations. This gets to a little bit what we were just talking about, because it's really important to think about. I'm showing you averages, but in any given case, whether the kid would be better or not, that really depends on what the context we're talking about is. And so, like, what if there's harmful parents? I just brought up the instance of abuse. There are two really well done studies from recent years in economics that are showing if a child's parent is a convicted criminal, if they happen to be assigned to a judge that has a higher likelihood of putting that parent in prison, or that someone with that conviction in prison, it's actually beneficial for the kid. Okay, and this just underscores the point. It's not always better for a kid to have two parents in the households. And so if the incremental case we're talking about is one where the second parent would be harmful, it would be beneficial for the kid not to have the second parent in the household. I find it hard to think that 40% of kids are born to parents where the second parent would not be a positive net contributor to their household. Okay, I'm going to show you one other thing. The context of, again, the idea that the context really matters for what I call the marriage premium for kids. So let me just show you guys this real quick, because then you'll know immediately what I'm talking about. The marriage premium for kids, like how much they're going to benefit from having two parents in the home versus one, is going to depend on the mother's own level of resources, what the second parent would bring in. So what's the difference between total resources and mom's resources? So again, if the mom is earning high incomes herself, getting a lot of welfare support, getting a ton of help from the government, from relatives, she might be able to do quite well for her child on their own. If the dad is, out of work, an emotional drain, the resources into the household might not matter. But if you're talking about, a mom with a high school degree making $25,000, she has a child with a guy who's a high school degree making $40,000, that increment might really matter to the kid. And then it depends on the production function, how we translate resources into outcomes, and that's going to depend on the outcome. So just like very descriptively, this is from the PSID. And I think this just is an important point that often gets lost in these conversations, because everyone just wants to focus on keeping kids out of poverty and then say, well, the answer is to have a stronger safety net. We're not just talking about keeping kids out of poverty. Let's talk about how many of them get a high school degree by age 20, or how many of them get a college degree by age 25. If we look at, these are just unadjusted, if we just look at the gaps in the likelihood that a kid graduates high school by age 20 between those who live with an unmarried versus married mother, the largest gap is in this middle group. And that's not surprising, because if you have two parents without a high school degree, even if, they're together, you're pretty disadvantaged. If you have a mom with a college degree, you're probably going to have sufficient resources in your household and, attend decent enough schools that you're going to get a high school degree. The biggest gap is in the middle. And also, this is precisely where we've seen the largest decrease, right? This is the group of people. You have two high school graduates. Each one alone is a bit economically vulnerable. But if they're together, they're much more likely to be able to provide their child with stability and sufficient economic resources in their childhood. Now let's look at the percent of children with a college degree. Very few kids whose moms, a minority of children whose moms don't have a college degree will themselves have a college degree. So here actually we see the largest gaps among the kids of the most educated moms. Because even if the moms with a high school degree, the difference there between getting a college degree, that goes from 4.8 to 18% proportional increase. But if you look at the kids of moms who have some college or a college degree, the gap in college completion is 17 percentage points and 28 percentage points. And so I think this is why I'm focused on, a lot of the pushback I got is the problem's not that there's not a second parent in the house, it's that our safety net isn't strong enough. We're never going to have, enough Medicaid to close this gap in college going. And so this is why I think it's really important and well past time, we actually focus on the role that married parents and the divergence in two-parent households is playing in driving class gaps and kids' outcomes and perpetuating advantage and disadvantage across generations. Here's where I just control for income and show you that income makes the intercept go down, but it doesn't go away. So it's not just income. Turns out second parents do more than just provide income to their kid. The time, the supervision, the emotional bandwidth, that's all helpful for kids. Last point, boys are particularly disadvantaged by the single mother family structure. Really compelling evidence shows this. And so, Black boys in particular, it's not just not having a dad in their home that disadvantages them. Work, again, coming out of a recent paper from the Opportunity Insights Labs, shows that the single biggest negative predictor of the Black-white gap in boys' earnings as adulthood, meaning what is the one thing that is most predictive of a smaller racial gap in adult male earnings between Black and white men? It's the share of Black dads that were in their neighborhood. Okay, so this is like an additional finding beyond what I showed you earlier from the Opportunity Insights work, showing that the share of single parent homes was a really high negative predictor of upward mobility. Having Black dads, not just in one's house, but in the neighborhood, is really helpful for Black boys. The problem is only a minority of Black boys in this country live in a neighborhood with a high share of Black dads. And so this is why, again, if we don't address this disadvantage is just going to perpetuate across generations. Let's think back to our conversation about marriageable men. We now have millions of boys growing up without a dad in their house. And then in 30 years, we're hoping that they know how to be good husbands and stable fathers, providers. Okay, this is my final slide and I'll stop talking. I'll just leave this up. What do I think we can and should be done? The most controversial statement, I think, in my whole book is that I think we need to foster a norm of two-parent home for kids. I don't think we should accept a new reality where the two-parent family is a thing of the past for less educated, low-income Americans. This is where a lot of people bristle. They will say it's over, get over it, and let's shore up the safety net. And for all, the reasons I've been describing, that doesn't seem as empathetic as I think people would like it to be. Why should the kids born to college-educated parents be so much more likely to have the benefits of two parents in their household? I think kids deserve more than that. I already said this, I won't bemoan the economic independence of women, nor do I think what we need to be doing is stigmatize single mothers. But I do say that realizing I'm trying to thread the needle here because I do think we need to reestablish this norm. There are a whole bunch of government programs, of community programs that are trying to help vulnerable families. They operate on shoestring budgets because strengthening families is not a policy priority. Only 1% of the Administration for Children and Families budget goes to programs aimed at families. It's like 50 times we spend so much more on Head Start, which I'm all for and is still underfunded, but that's like $66 billion a year as compared to like 14 million. We've never prioritized strengthening families. And so there's not a lot of public support for these programs. There's not nearly as much sort of research energy going into studying programs that can help strengthen families as compared to all the other things we try to do, which is like improve schools, advance college completion, et cetera. Okay, I will stop talking.
Thank you, Melissa. That was great. Very provocative. So we still have 5 more minutes for questions. So feel free to raise your hand if you want to ask a question. Maybe in the meantime, I can ask a question myself. So recently, I read a paper, I think published in 2005 in the Journal of I think Demography, I believe, that was arguing that divorce doesn't quite affect children achievement. The paper was published, authored by Pierre and Rothstein, and maybe you're familiar with it. I'm not a demographer, but I was surprised by the result, because they argue that divorce doesn't really affect children's academic achievements once you control for family background and all kinds of fixed effects. So what's your take on that?
Okay, I have 2 comments on this. One,
Yeah.
there's a paper that's about to drop. I'm not one of the authors. There's a paper that's about to drop as soon as it goes through all census clearance that has massive amounts of data showing how kids are affected by divorce. And divorce is not good for kids. Okay. Second, on this point, this is the game that researchers like to play. You control for everything and then say family structure barely matters. But my point is, in the real world, we don't control for everything, right? So, I mean, you can't make it all go away, but income heuristically is about half of the, if you control for household income in the regression, you can get the gaps in kids' outcomes to basically halve, right? But again, that's one of the biggest things that parents do, is bring 2 sources of income into the household, right? The majority of moms work. Median household earnings among a married couple versus a single mom is twice as high, like throughout the education distribution. So controlling for it doesn't really tell us that it doesn't work. It tells us that it's one of the key mechanisms, but that's the game these researchers play, and I've played it, but the interpretation is really important. I think you're figuring out all the mechanisms through which 2-parent households are beneficial for kids, not that they're not beneficial.
Okay. Johan has a question.
Professor
I
Wack.
think I was on the line first before you.
Oh, I didn't see you. Sorry. You need to turn on your video so I can see your question. Sorry.
Oh, I had my hand up.
Okay.
Sorry. I just wanted to ask, thank you for this very interesting presentation. I haven't read your book, so I don't know if you make much of Catherine Eden's work. What I took from her work is that there has been just a vast shift in expectations for male behavior. That being a good husband is a role, it's a script. It's highly prescriptive, it's highly normative, and it's also highly judgmental in that it is backed by a great deal of judgmentalism on the part of what we expect from men. And when the women in Catherine Eden's studies were interviewed who'd had children out of wedlock, they didn't complain that much about a lack of earnings, although that was downstream from what they were complaining about. They were complaining about crummy boyfriends, bad behavior, sexual infidelity, big one.
Yeah.
The most prominent complaint, right? Drug use, unreliability, lack of restraint, poor conflict resolution, lack of sobriety. I mean, all of these sort of bourgeois norms had just kind of declined and disappeared. Now take sexual infidelity. I mean, the success and stability of upper middle class marriages suggests, this is, I know, startling, that upper middle class men are more sexually faithful because this is really a relationship killer. Maybe it's because they don't have the time or the opportunity to step out, or I don't know what the explanation is, but I think that behavior has diverged for men by social class and education.
Yeah, this is, I mean, we could talk about this for half an hour. This is really, really important on many, many dimensions. So Cathy Eden's work showing that these women put motherhood before marriage is important in establishing, it's not that people outside the college educated class reject marriage, right? So we'd feel very differently if, like, what some people claim is like, well, women don't want to get married anymore. Like, no, actually people who have interviewed these unmarried moms, the moms want to get married, but the guys they partner with are like sucky. And you're right that this relationship infidelity, I mean, lots of ethnographers and people who interview low-income couples, the lack of trust and infidelity is huge. I will say that Cathy's follow-up book where she talks to the dads the tone is very different, because the dads are like, well, I want to be a good dad, but now she has had kids with a second man and doesn't let me see the kids. So there's a case to be made here too, that in many, which is what she makes in her second book, which is that some of these women act like gatekeepers. So I'm not, you could point to sort of, again, we could be empathetic to both the women and men at different levels. When I talk to these people who run these these community, some of the programs I started mentioning, in these affected communities, they do a lot of relationship education. And so this gets back to the point I think I was, touching on, which is having role models. If you have these boys and they don't grow up with dads in their house, and they don't see a husband showing, hey, you've got to stay faithful or this isn't going to work. Like, you talk to these people who work with high schoolers on trying to build relationships, and their stories are grim. But these are exactly the kinds of programs that I think we need to be investing in as part of trying to break this cycle, which is also why I'm increasingly impatient with the well-intentioned liberal knee-jerk reaction, which is, let's just send them more welfare checks, or let's just increase the child tax credit. Why should moms outside the college educated class not be able to expect to have a committed partner? Right. So all of that, like 100% yes. And that's a really important part of the story.
Okay. So that, Johan and then Ritin, those are the two last questions.
Yeah. So I was wondering how much of your findings can be applied the further back you go in time. What I mean by that is, like, I'm looking at a particular set of Blacks, West Indians, who were in the mid-Atlantic between 1890 and 1950. And I was looking at their marriage rates, and their marriage rates are higher than that of not only African Americans, but Irish and Scots as well. So things like time and shared emotional energy can definitely be applied without sort of looking at quantitative data. But I was wondering what you thought about applying the idea of social behavior, like marriage benefiting progeny, without or using more modern data like the data that you're using. Like, how much of what you're saying can I apply to, let's say, 1905?
It's a really good question, and I'm not sure. The reason why I don't have an immediate gut reaction is, if I even in the book, this is so cringy, but the publisher told me I had to introduce myself because the reader was going to want to know what my background is. But I think about this, I come from Italian immigrants. They had no education. My grandparents worked together. My grandma took in piecemeal. What they had to accomplish to sort of get their kids, I don't know, to the point where then my parents could go set up a middle-class lifestyle. In some sense, we've raised the bar, right? So even I showed you, it takes a lot of resources to get through college. And so I'd have to really think about this. And of course, we don't have to go that far back in time to realize most of those households, the mothers weren't bringing in additional income, even though they were, of course, doing a lot of household production. But I don't know exactly how much of, if we took the same trends now in a different economic context, right? And what it was required to sort of launch your kids to be successful adults. I think it's an interesting question. I'd have to think harder about it.
Okay, last question.
I had a very quick question about joint families, and if you looked into them. And I'm from India, and in India, joint families, that is two brothers raising their families together. So perhaps 4-parent households. They're slowly going down and giving way to nuclear families. And obviously, a nuclear family with 2 married parents, you've shown is great. I'm wondering if the gap or the change in improvement or the opposite of improvement is the same when you go from 2 to 4-parent households where people kind of live together, a brother and sister live together, or grandparents stay in the same area, or cousins live together. I know this is not even closely applicable to the US, but I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, so the short answer is I don't know. I don't, we don't have a lot of studies of this. I know you weren't doing this, but one quip I get where people think, they're being really clever and shooting down my point is like, oh, well, then polygamy must be real good because then you'd have 3 parents instead of 2. But of course, like, no, 2 parents, each kid is born with 2 parents. I know exactly who those 2 parents are. And in fact, 2 biological parents, there's a lot of studies showing that that's the best thing for kids' outcomes. And step parents and sort of boyfriends who fill in the role, those can be quite damaging, right? That's where there's a lot of sexual abuse, a lot of, so it's not, once you leave the 2-parent household, who the other people are and their commitment to the child, you just raise a whole bunch of other questions about relationships that I think are more complicated than the more straightforward. We see this resource gap between 1 biological parent and 2 parents. That being said, right, like all my common sense and everything I've talked about would lead me to think that the more like loving people in a kid's life, the better for them. But I don't know of really rigorous studies that have showed the difference between having 2 parents and a grandma or that kind of thing.
Okay. Thank you very much, Melissa. This was great. Thank you, everybody, for joining us and for asking questions and giving comments. So next week, we will have Richard Hananaya. He is going to give a talk in person. We'll probably have a hybrid session. And he will talk about his new book on civil rights law. So you're all welcome to attend as well.
Thank you for bearing with me. I'm so sorry about the
no worries.
hang up at the beginning.
Lisa.
Okay, thanks.
It was great.
Thanks, Melissa.
Thank you.